Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature of which we're a part, with deep gratitude to all our ancestors, all the generations before us that have brought us to the present moment, I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on the fourth session of a 5-day program on the crisis and challenge of democracy in the United States, knowing that democracy is under threat worldwide because of rising authoritarianism. But there's a particular urgency in the United States, as we've been seeing with the House Committee on January 6th that has been holding its hearings literally while this week has been unfolding. That former President Donald Trump sought to execute a coup while he was still in office to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. And that coup is still going on with the alliance between Donald Trump, majority interest in the Republican Party, and the extreme right to subvert the electoral process, to repress people's right to vote. And so democratic forces are beginning to coalesce and to mobilize in an unprecedented way around the November elections coming up. These are extraordinarily important elections. And so we at Humanity Rising have been convening a series of programs around the urgent need for all of us to not only pay attention, but to take individual and concerted action to preserve democracy as we've known it. One of the points that has emerged out of this week is that even though our situation seems acute, and it is, this is the first time in the 246 years of history in the United States, we've had a incontrovertible coup attempt, extraordinarily led by the president before he left office. So this is urgent, but we have been here before. And many of the panelists have reminded us that over the centuries, the struggle for democracy is always present. There are always forces that seek to undermine the right of the people to freely assemble, freely speak, and freely vote. It's an extraordinary thing if you think about human history, that some of the most obvious rights and virtues that one would think we would all take for granted because they are obviously what we need to ensure inclusivity, empowerment, and wise governance. They're always under attack by forces who prefer subterfuge and prefer disparity and prefer coercive control. So it's unique what we face in this moment, and we've been here before. So in that spirit, I invite all of you, before we dive into our program, to take a moment with me to center yourself in your body. Your body is nature. We are nature. And close your eyes if you can and center your attention on your heart. And for the next minute or so, as you listen to the music, attune yourself in your heart and feel each other. Thank you, everyone. It's now my pleasure to introduce our two conveners for this week, George Cappannelli, who's the founder and CEO of Age Nation and is passionate about democracy, and John Steiner, who with his wife, Margot King, networkers extraordinaire, also passionate about democracy. They brought together activists from across the United States day by day. And today, a new group to inspire us and to motivate us to take the kind of action that we need to take in our generation to preserve democracy as we know it for the future generations. So George, John, welcome. And I turn the program over to you.
Thanks, Jim, as always. Thanks for creating this remarkable vehicle called Humanity Rising that has allowed so many people to speak on so many different topics over the last couple of years. Just a couple of additional words of introduction. We began this series in March, and we'll do several more weeks in the series between here and the midterms, because it's our belief that we can't afford to wait for 2024 to put our efforts completely into this process, that the results in 2022 could very well determine the course that democracy takes over the next period of time. I also want to say that Jim said, and I agree, and many of our guests over this period have agreed, that the United States and other democracies have been threatened and challenged before. But I personally believe that there are some exigent problems or issues that exist that make this time unique. Not only the fact that our former president and chief instigator is doing all he and his party can to undercut the well-being of democracy, but what's on the line at the moment, because of climate change and its impact, is literally the well-being of humanity, the well-being of the other species, and the well-being of the habitat itself. And so November is not just about democracy in America. It's not just about keeping a constructive group of people in office. It's about preventing others from coming into office that are opposed to the well-being of humanity, of the other species and the planet. I'll have more to say as we go along. I'd like to, John, as my convener and co-host, and really, it's not just this week, but this series has been so enriched and deepened by what John and Margot have brought here as conveners. And so I want you as an audience to be aware of that. John?
Thank you, George. Thank you, Jim. Well, it's really on behalf of George and Jim and really everyone watching and who will watch, it is an honor to introduce today Joan Blades, Leah Greenberg, and Shayna Gallagher. If you guys women would all come on. We're very happy to have a program with 3 women today. Note that, everyone. So I will just jump in. I will also say Joan and I have worked together for almost 20 years. And she is a co-founder with her husband, Wes Boyd, of Move On, which started in, Joan, I think it was 1966 during the Clinton era where—
98.
98, thank you. I thought I had that a couple of years off. But the phrase was, let's censure the president and move on. And that has led to one of the really important progressive grassroots organizations in the country. And one of the reasons is because of the leadership you and Wes provided. And the lineage of leaders for Move On over these years has really been extraordinary. Joan also co-founded another remarkable group called Moms Rising. And she and I and many others have worked together over at least the last decade, as she's been the co-founder of Living Room Conversations, which is an open source effort to build respectful, caring connections, conversations across ideological, cultural, and party lines while embracing shared values. And I'll note, I think we're in a short game here in terms of truly protecting our democracy, about which we're going to speak a lot today. And our long game is, how do we bring this country back together with people who are willing, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum? And there is a surprisingly large number of willing citizens, even Trump supporters, who want to talk with the other side. And democracy needs a place to sit down. And that is something Joan and her cohorts have been providing. We'll hear more about that. Joan is also the author of The Custom Fit Workplace, which won the Nautilus Book Award about 10 years ago, and the Motherhood Manifesto, which won another major book prize. What brought her to both of these works that she's done as a progressive and as a transpartisan is she's a mediator and attorney by training, an inclination, and nature lover and artist, and a true believer in the power of citizens. Leah, welcome to you. Your beginning with, in a way, why we're here is not so different from how Move On started. And you'll tell us a little more about that. You and your wonderful husband, Ezra, who we've had on before, sent out an email to some friends of saying, we ought to do this and that. And before you know it, you had a major national effort called Indivisible. And we look forward to hearing more about that. You are a co-founder and co-director with Ezra, and we may well have him on again. Prior to founding Indivisible, you worked as a public policy director for Tom Perello when he was governor of Virginia, and also on the Hill with him when he was a congressman. And I think also what is striking is you've managed a human trafficking work and also as investments for a manager for Humanity United. So you bring a very wide-ranging background to this, and also for our audience. And I think this is important, that you and Ezra were featured as one of Time's 100 most influential people in 2019 and GQ's most powerful people in Trump's Washington, and ranked number 2 on the political 50 list of top thinkers, doers, and visionaries in terms of transforming American politics. But we won't let that get in the way of what you have to offer today. And thank you for being willing to be here at a time where you're at a place where a storm last night essentially knocked over a lot of trees, and you can tell us a little more about why you're there. And it was challenging to get on today. And Leah, Shayna, I have just enormous respect for you. You really, as a younger woman, you were the co-founder and our co-founder and executive director of Unpack. And we'll hear more from each of you about your organizations. But prior to launching that, you ran the 2 largest electoral student organizations in US history, designing, launching, and managing both the Beto for Texas campaign, and we might want to hear of how you think he's doing in his race right now, and the Bernie 2020 student organizing program. And you have spent your entire career empowering young people to be agents of change in our political system. And I think we have 3 people on whose passion is democracy, whose passion is citizen engagement and agency. And George, I'm going to let you ask the first question.
Well, thanks. What I would like is, as we go along, rather than stopping for individual explorations of your organizations, if you'll give us more detail and information on the how and the who and the whatnot. So one of the reasons we convened this series is that it's really important, obviously, to bring to the attention of more people around the world, and most particularly in the US, the real challenge democracy is facing. But beyond that, what we really want to look to is our solutions that can be applied. So we know the threat's serious, but by the end of the series, we want to be sure that not one viewer, not one listener can say, I did not know how I could get involved in helping to save democracy. So that's part of our agenda. My question for you, three each, is to, I'd like to know where you place the level of threat and what your concern is at this moment in time.
Joan, do you want to start?
Okay. Well, I'm not sure if we've got a scale 1 to 10 or on threat level or 1 to 100, it is code orange, at least, if not red, in my threat level. I'm more of a colors person. What can we say? And it's something where I sort of look at it as we've gotten increasingly polarized since '98, when I thought things were too polarized. And almost like the AA thing, have we hit bottom yet? Because I think we're going to need to collectively decide we have to shift the dynamics, because we're living in separate narratives. I live in Berkeley, California. I come by my progressive origins very honestly, but I was truly curious about how people saw things so differently. And now it's not just that people see things differently, we have different sets of facts. And a democracy cannot survive with separate narratives. So it's, can we dig into our humanity and honoring each other's humanity and find a way to discover each other's higher, visions together? Because when you get right down to it, almost everybody wants good things for their community, good things for their family, and good things for the world. And we're visioning it so very differently. So finding the tools to reestablish these connections and care about each other. We keep on thinking it's about persuading people, and people are first and foremost about their heart, and then the head comes in. And that's the interesting, perverse piece of this, is the most persuasive thing you can do is be in real relationship with people. And then hearts change and the whole dynamic shifts. And our hearts are not very open right now in many cases. I can't tell you how many people say to me on both sides, I don't want to talk to those people. So I'm the person that is trying to get people to do something that's scary and big to them, and it's actually really wonderful and kind of a way of making our world richer personally and on the much larger scale. And I could go on, but I want others to talk.
Thank you, Joan. Leah, why don't you go next?
Jo-
Go ahead, George. You want to?
No, Joan, I was just going to say a friend of mine who's a poet, his name is Mark Nepo. One of the things he says is that what we reach for may be different, but what makes us reach is the same. And I think that that's an important thing for us all to remember. Leah, please.
I would agree with Joan that we are in whatever the very high alert territory is for democracy. I think that I like to think of it in terms of kind of the long crisis and the immediate crisis, where we have to recognize that there has been this long-term process of, I would say, asymmetric polarization, where really kind of the sorting that has been occurring within our political parties, really arguably since the civil rights movement prompted a political realignment in the 1960s, has basically led to an increasing level of radicalization within the Republican Party. It's been known by different names over different times, but I think the simplest and cleanest way to describe it is MAGA faction, which is the heirs to the Southern strategy, the heirs to the Tea Party movement, the sort of faction within the Republican Party that is dominant, that does not essentially is prepared to break our democracy before they share it. And I think it is both possible to recognize that has long historical roots, that is part of a broader phenomenon, and also, so it's not, in some ways, it's not actually that we are in danger in a new and different way. It's that our democracy was never actually a full democracy, and the closer we got to enfranchisement, the more we have courted these forces of backlash, while also recognizing that we are in an utterly pivotal time in this specific moment, and that the faction that does not accept kind of the legitimacy of our democracy has adopted a new and incredibly dangerous set of strategies in recent years that put us much closer to the brink of the real transformation of our institutions and of what we think of as a functioning democracy. And as you're watching, both the norm breaking and the degradation of institutions under the Trump administration and the rise of the big lie movement over the last couple of years, as you're seeing people focus particularly on, how do we first of all, folks who are covering for and enabling the avoidance of accountability for an actual criminal conspiracy and attempted violent coup in January, but then the ongoing continuation of that movement in the form of people who are running for office right now, who are election administration deniers, essentially, who are making really clear and direct as part of their pitch that they do not intend to function the way that election administrators, attorneys general, governors historically are supposed to, and in fact perceive that as a vehicle for greater power for their side. That is, it takes nothing away from the longer historical view and the concern about the long-term asymmetric polarization to say that this is an immediate and urgent crisis that has to be addressed squarely on those terms.
Thank you, Leah. Shayna.
All right, I think I'm up. Thank you, Leah and Joan, for leading this conversation in a way that I agree with and I think sets the tone pretty clearly, which is that, yes, we are in an absolute crisis of our democracy, but I think what Leah was just saying in terms of our democracy having never really been truly representative and working for everyone in America based on its promise is really important to remember. And I'm going to try to weave together what both of these women said in my response to present a very holistic answer to all of your viewers. I think that this might be a hot take, but we are a nonpartisan organization. And I think that from the standpoint of trying to bridge this massive divide that Joan was mentioning and the polarization of this country, that despite what Leah was saying is true, that the MAGA faction of the Republican Party has become increasingly willing to cheat in order to maintain power rather than play by the rules and uphold our democracy, that it is really important to recognize the flaws and the corruption on both sides of the aisle when you are trying to bridge this gap. And so this is something that Unpack does very intentionally. We talk about how both major political parties operate within a system of legalized corruption. And that is not because either party, well, the way we describe it is, that is not because either party or any of the politicians in these party, for the most part, are evil or sinister or trying to subvert democracy necessarily. It is just because that is how the system was built and has become broken by big money and special interests. And so in order to stay in power and serve constituents and hopefully better communities in our country, so many politicians feel like they have to participate in this system where on the congressional level, right, they're spending upwards of 80% of their time fundraising and increasingly out of touch with their constituents and not actually getting anything done. And again, this happens on both sides of the aisle. So if we are to bridge this gap and do the deep work that Joan is mentioning of really healing divides and actually trying to turn the tide towards more unity and progress, then we do need to acknowledge that the problem affects both political parties. It is not just one. That said, we are in a crisis, right? And these midterm elections coming up, and certainly 2024, mark really pivotal moments. And so for our democracy and whether or not it will continue. And so it can feel sort of jarring to use tactics like empathetic listening and conversations in a moment of crisis. But if you, for example, were to start now and you were to say, what are the elections in my state that are really imperative for upholding democracy? If you're in Michigan, for example, that's the Secretary of State's race, right? If you are in Arizona, there's something on the ballot called Arizonans for Free and Fair Elections. That's a ballot initiative that would really safeguard democracy. There are various examples. If you were to start now and say, not only am I going to vote in these elections, but I am going to very intentionally reach out to people in my network who I know do not have the same political views that I do, and try to have a conversation with them and hear about their perspectives and truly listen to them and make them feel heard and valued and affirmed. And over time, share with them my opinions and try to have a very respectful, honest conversation with them over time about these critical elections and why they matter for our democracy, and ask these folks to vote a certain way. That's called relational organizing. That is our most powerful tool. That is the most powerful tool that any of us have as individuals. And so it's not just about voting, which is very important and everyone should certainly do. And you should look into the elections in your state that are really crucial for, again, upholding our democracy. There are certain races that matter more than others for that, especially in given states. But you should also take it upon yourself to, if you agree that there's this massive divide in this country and it's a huge problem and we're really not getting anywhere based on, unfortunately, the actions of politicians in either party, because again, they're operating within this broken system, and you agree in this, long view, bottom up healing that does need to happen, then it can't start soon enough, and it has to start with you really thinking about your network and who's in it and who can you have some of these conversations with, again, over time. Not to lecture your conservative aunt. I happen to have an aunt who flew from Los Angeles to DC for the insurrection. She was there. She was present. She was certainly engaged and active and still very much of that mindset. But we talk often, and I try to share my perspective. And, I can't say that we have made enormous progress, but we have certainly made some progress. And that is the sort of long view, in your network conversation and relationship that you should not be afraid to broach, as long as you are approaching it from a stance of wanting to learn. And again, empathetic listening, not lecturing about your opinion, then that is a really important step that you can take to try to do something about this.
Thank you, Shayna.
Crisis,
and I think you've just given as good an advertisement for Living Room Conversations as I may have ever heard. So you guys, I think, have something to do together. And I also appreciate, I think what you and Joan are talking about is the long view. There's no question. But Leah, you're really working on the short view here. And you have some projects that Indivisible has been doing and continues to do, but one I think in particular. And I'd love to hear how you're addressing Code Red for Democracy between now and November. And then the other thing I'd like to ask is that Leah and Joan and Shayna ask each other some questions here. Don't let us just be the moderators, because you guys are on the ground doing this work. And we'd love to get your responses to each other and tee up some questions for each other. But Leah, go ahead on the short term.
Sure, absolutely. Well, we are starting from the premise that this is going to be an absolutely crucial election, both in terms of what it means for the potential to govern in Washington, D.C., but also for everything from local to state elections that really set the terms and determine the ground on which we're operating going forward for the overall future of our democracy. As Shayna mentioned, the referendum in Arizona, that's a really great example. There are more around the country that are going to be also very crucial. So what we're doing right now is both working with Indivisibles who are often, and I should say Indivisible is itself a network of locally led volunteer communities all over the country. There are about 3,000 Indivisible groups all over, geographically distributed in every state and congressional district. These are folks who are not professional activists. They are not professional nonprofit members. They came together because they wanted to make a positive difference and turn back the tide of extremism. And they do everything from advocacy to their elected officials to knocking doors and running for office themselves. And they are really, really just looking for the best ways to have an impact as communities of people who care about a better future of our country. So one of the things that we're working with folks to do, in addition to kind of the traditional voter contact that a lot of folks will do during this time, right, the knocking doors and making calls and sending postcards, is also thinking about how do we actually make sure in a really, really tough electoral situation, in a moment when a lot of people are hurting economically and scared about what the future holds, that we're both empathizing with people's pain, and we're also really making sure that they understand the reality of the alternative on the ballot. The reality is that we're in this, as folks have echoed, this pivotal short-term crisis, right? Where Republicans, we're waiting any day on a decision that will likely end Roe v. Wade for this country, which will immediately have severe implications for the health and safety of hundreds of million, over 100 million women. We are in a period of time where folks who are openly making their intention to deliver electoral votes to Donald Trump in 2024, a central part of their campaign pitch are getting on the ballot in places as terrifying as the Republican Senate or nominee for Pennsylvania gubernatorial race. It's really important that even in a situation, and I think we can all acknowledge that voters are not in a generally good mood right now. If you look at the polling on how people feel like the direction of the country is going, it's not great. Inflation is really scaring people. We need to be able to make that case that both we're trying and it's taking time, and also the other side is not an acceptable alternative because their extremism is so significant that they really are a threat to people's rights, to their freedom, to their safety, and to the safety of our democracy. The way that that is going to work with our folks is really about, again, local, credible, authentic messengers who are based in communities, who are intentionally figuring out how do we elevate the contrast between what we stand for and what our values are, and what the other side is proposing to do if they are trusted with power. And that's everything from looking at, how do you get on the record the local state legislator in Arizona who is actively praising January 6th, and how do you kind of amplify that story within the community so that when people are hearing about the January 6th headlines when they're hearing about the January 6th hearings, they're also relating it right back to that local legislator and thinking, this is not an abstract problem on my television. This is a thing that is happening in my community. How do you make sure that people really hear and are understanding the implications of what will happen with the loss of Roe? How do you make sure that all of the conflicts that we are seeing around the country on schools, where essentially the heirs to the Tea Party are showing up at school boards and demanding the removal of accurate history from textbooks or from lesson plans, who are harassing trans kids and teachers who are, pursuing a campaign of book banning? How do we make sure that there is a loving, compassionate, alternate force of people who are showing up in those places and advancing our values, our pro-inclusion narrative, our story of something that is bigger and more positive, and making them look like the extremist minority in the face of a powerful, multiracial, inclusive majority? So we're working with Indivisibles particularly on how do you do all of these things with a particular eye towards earned media, and not, I don't want to say virality, because people, when you hear virality, you think like ice bucket challenge and, let's all try and go viral. It's not about like something goes viral and gets viewed a bazillion times. It's about what are you sharing to your community that gets shared a few more times within your own community that influences how people understand the world around them, the stories they're telling themselves, what they understand to be at stake in November.
What a terrific articulation, Leah, and the same, Joan and Shayna. One thing I will ask is, as this program proceeds, Joan, you've been doing some of it, and each of you have mentioned, it would be great to have as many of the critical elections named in the chat or after the chat that we can give to our viewers as possible. A very vital piece of information that a lot of us who are not on the focus all the time have in mind. The other thing I want to say is that John and I go back and forth on this conversation a lot, and we have a fundamental agreement, but I believe that we are in what I would call in extremis. And in nautical terms, that's a term that means that when a ship is en route to collide, to run aground, or to capsize, a lot of the traditional rules of the road need to be set aside, and the primary focus must be on saving the ship. So while I agree entirely that we have an obligation and a responsibility as citizens to reach out to one another, I believe that when the building is burning, you don't take a lot of time trying to talk standby people who aren't interested in fighting the fire to fight the fire. You focus on those people willing to roll up their sleeves, put the fire out, or avoid the ship's collision or whatever the danger is. Long term, talk all we want. Short term, get it done. In a second, Joan, please. The other thing that I want to mention is that regarding conversation, there was an interesting piece this morning in the New York Times summary, and it was entitled Trumpers' Terrors or Trumpers' Fears. And I thought it was a beautiful point made that so many people since before 2016 have become so invested in supporting this MAGA movement that to get them to declare being wrong, which as we all know is one of the most terrible things human beings fear, right, is a very hard thing to do. So one of the things I'd like us to talk about just briefly is how can we invite, perhaps through examples, perhaps through stories, whatever, how can we, rather than demanding that these people admit that they're wrong, how do we spread information that allows them to make that position and decision for themselves? For an example, in one of our conversations earlier this week, one of the things that came up is that a lot of young people are not watching the House committee hearings. A lot of people who are off to politics aren't listening. How do we decide a new way to get the truth of those messages out? How do we invent different social media means, and how do we communicate in a different way than the formalized dais, 8 to 10 individuals, congressional room? And how do we get that information out? What do you think?
I'd love to respond to this because young people were invoked, and that is my group that I spend the most time with. There was a lot there, George, though, so let me unpack, which coincidentally is the name of our organization. So you're right, obviously, that as I was saying before, it's difficult and jarring sometimes to use these long game tactics when we are in crisis. I would just reiterate that, for example, the elections and the issues and the campaigns that are really imperative for democracy that Unpack is focusing on, which I will put in the chat later, but those are in 5 states. Arizona, it's that ballot initiative that I mentioned, and then the Senate election. In Wisconsin, Senate and gubernatorial. In Michigan, Secretary of State primarily. In Pennsylvania, Senate and gubernatorial. And then in Florida, It's mostly defense and also gubernatorial. Florida's very much the long game, but those are our 5 states, right? In those places, it is possible to volunteer on those campaigns, or the campaigns for the person who is saying, I will not try to subvert democracy and vote for me, right? It is possible to volunteer on those campaigns, but I want to remind your listeners that when we organize, there are 2 options in terms of the groups of people that we organize. There are people we know and people we don't know. And most campaigns do a really good job of setting volunteers up to talk to people that they don't know, to talk to strangers. That's especially the case if I live in Texas, but I want to work on the Michigan Secretary of State's race, right? Inevitably, I do not know anyone who's a voter, or most voters in Michigan who can vote in that race. So I will not be able to I can volunteer in a way that allows me to speak with strangers in Michigan, but I will not be able to do nearly as valuable or influential work as if I were to be organizing people that I do know, because we have more power over people that we know. And this is proven in the data. Relational organizing people that we have a pre-existing relationship with, is up to 4 times more effective than organizing strangers. And it's especially true for young people. We care so much more about the people that we know, other young people in our lives that we have shared experience with, than a stranger knocking on our door saying, hey, you don't know me, we have nothing in common, but please do this thing that I'm asking you to do. So, and vote for this person you know nothing about, right? So even though it is very important to organize strangers, and I don't mean to discourage that, and these are important races that you can volunteer on, I would argue that we should definitely be doing both simultaneously if you have the capacity for that, because again, these long view conversations are the most powerful tool that we have. To your sort of later point about young people and them not paying attention, that's absolutely the case. And I would, again, invoke the first comment that I was making about how the system is broken. Our view at Unpack is that young people have not seen a system that works for them for their entire lives. So they don't believe in democracy as an institution in a lot of cases. And that is really scary for a lot of older folks to hear. But again, the reality is, if I'm a young person who, in my case, really cares about climate change, what have I ever seen the federal government do to actually address the climate crisis at the scale and with the urgency that we need? Nothing. So that doesn't give me a lot of faith in democracy. And that is because, again, the system's been broken for a very, very long time. Young people have not seen a functional democracy that is actually delivering on the issues that we care about and representing young people and actively reaching out to young people and empowering them to be a part of our political system for their entire lives. So again, this has been a long-running crisis that is now reaching these points of becoming apparent to more and more people. And obviously January 6th was a really stark example of that. Trump's entire presidency was a very stark example of that. But we actually need to approach, for the standpoint of young people, we need to approach the issue of the importance of maintaining a democracy from the angle of what are issues young people care about. And this is something that Unpack works really hard on. We don't come in and say, hey, young people, democracy is so important and it's under attack, please vote. It's, what issues do you care about? What are things affecting you in your life right now? And then helping them to understand how those issues are connected to our broken democracy, how lobbying by the fossil fuel industry or the NRA is actually what in so many cases prevents action on climate legislation or gun violence legislation, and how that, as one of the many examples, unfortunately, of our broken democracy, is what stands in the way between young people and solutions to the problems that we care about. So that's how we can bridge this divide. And I would urge anyone listening to this, if you have younger relatives or friends that you're trying to talk to about these elections, don't come into that conversation by saying, have you registered to vote? Are you planning on voting? Because if I'm a young person who doesn't actually believe that voting matters, that is not a compelling way to start that conversation. It's, what do you care about? What issues matter to you? What's the sort of impact you want to make in the world, right? Make it about them, and then help them to understand how what they care about, who they are as a person, their identity, their values are connected to democracy as an institution, then how their participation in that system can help fix the system. And of course, again, it does take time over time, how our democracy is really in crisis and why this is such a crucial moment to, even if they haven't voted before, to give it a try, even though it's really hard for young people to vote in a lot of cases.
Thank you, Shayna. Joan, you've had your hand up. Great offering, Shayna, and very close to what we heard from Zach Malamed on Monday, who's with a group called the Next 50. Joan.
So just to end, Shayna, to add, the Does My Vote Matter Living Room Conversation Guide is a great one for having that conversation in a very kind of supportive, intentional way. And it's really fun. So it's, someone that does vote co-hosts with someone that isn't sure they're going to vote. And they each invite two friends, and it allows them to explore that. And it tends to lead toward people thinking they might want to vote after all, which is, hopefully one of the tools that could be useful. And I just wanted to basically chime in because I'm with you on this. The necessity for working on the upcoming election is absolutely there, but I think we have to do both. Domestic peace building has to happen at the same time, because that's really what we're doing, is domestic peace building. And the perverse thing about trying to persuade people is it's the less persuasive thing to do. It is that relationship that is more persuasive than anything. And I love it that you're in conversation with your aunt, who was part of going to DC on January 6th. Those relationships are critical. We soften each other, we create confusion. The reason I needed to do this work was I needed to understand why people saw things so differently than I did. And living in Berkeley, that didn't come naturally. I couldn't just turn to my neighbor, and I had to be quite intentional to hear voices outside of my normal political orientation. But having those conversations, climate is a top issue for a lot of us. That's how I got into a group called Reuniting America many years ago with John. And I had great conversations with people on the right. And we found, some common ground and by 2008, it was less possible to have a good conversation. I can note that the conversations I've had, one of my friends in Utah, climate wasn't on his list of concerns when we were first talking together. And it got onto his list, not the top of his list, but it got onto his list of concerns because of his friendship with me and another friend of his. Both of us very concerned. We care about what the people we care about. It's that human aspect that, I'm really hoping that this larger community can tap into, because people start to soften, and maybe your opposition is less hard against you, or maybe they start caring about what you do. Not as much, but it's perversely, they're caring about us caring about each other, and us holding the tension of our differences, which is really uncomfortable frequently. But trying to figure out how this person I love can feel that way and think that way, and still loving them, though I still disagree, right? It's a very interesting space we invite ourselves into. But I've learned a tremendous amount, and there's a lot I don't understand still. I am very confused about a lot of things. And I'll leave it with my confusion.
Joe, can I just respond really quickly to anyone who might be listening and thinking like, oh yeah, that sounds nice, but is it really going to work? I want to verify that this is born in the data. Like, the data confirms, data on persuasion and how do we actually influence opinions confirms that we do not change people's minds by lecturing them or debating with them. We are not actually, rational argument does not actually influence people's opinions. What influences their opinions is storytelling. We are storytelling creatures, and empathy and empathetic listening with another person. So that is actually how we move people. Again, it does take a long time. It's a frustrating answer because, again, we're in a moment of crisis, but like this is the best thing that the best tool that we have in our toolbox at this moment. And if you start now, we still got several months until the midterms and, 2 years until 2024. So once again, it's really never too soon to start activating your network.
And
I
Leah, how do you
appreciate your point of
respond to
view,
Leah?
Shayna.
Whoop.
I'm sorry, Shayna, and I appreciate your point of view. I also appreciate, Joan, your comment about an and, not an or. I support that enormously. My question, however, that I would still like an answer to is, right now, there are people working their bottoms off in Washington to tell a story to the American people. A story, not trying to convince, not trying to change, but to tell a story. I want to know how we can get that story out via networks, via different tools of social media, via different ways of communicating to an audience that isn't listening to the dedicated work that these members of Congress have been doing. And it is those stories, I believe, that can have an impact on what's going on in America. Now, as John mentioned, when we talked to Zach Mahmoud the other day, who has the Next 50, an organization that he runs, he was the one that said, God, I wish we could. And I said to him, and I challenge each one of you as well, how do we create and translate those stories to audiences that are not listening? Not trying to convince them of anything, but I believe Oliver Wendell Holmes once said that in the free marketplace of ideas, truth ultimately triumphs. And I believe that. And I believe, unfortunately, that the truth is not being heard. How do we do that?
I have an
Leah,
idea.
Leah, let's put that in your
Leah
court
should go first, though.
along with
Go
what
for it,
you
Leah.
said. Go for it.
Gosh, okay, there are so many different threads to follow up on right now. So I'm going to try and like fire off a couple of different things that are sort of responsive to the conversation that's been happening. So first of all, just to sort of plus one a couple of things that have been happening, we actually, in addition to kind of our electoral work, we also do deep canvassing longer term work, and basically have been trying to pilot a set of things that give indivisibles the tools to have values-based deep canvassing conversations not linked to a specific election, ballot initiative, et cetera, in their own communities as kind of a long-term relationship and community building tool. And what we found is that is something that is both meaningful for folks who are thinking about, not just how do I win the next election, but particularly in places where they're not even trying to win the next election. They just want like a few more people who agree with them and a few less people who are fully on Team Fox News. How do you shift the political climate over a longer horizon so that, right now, maybe you're in a 2080 situation and you're, in a few years, you might be in a 2575 situation. Like that is good and valuable and important work. And the other thing is I think we can sometimes get a little bit too binary about putting these things in tension with each other, right? A lot of the skills that you're talking about when you're talking about kind of doing the longer term values-based work is also really a lot of the approach. And I think Shayna is getting at this, a lot of the approach that you should take when you're trying to convince someone to vote. And we should also not be trying to framing it as a particularly binary persuasion versus mobilization situation, right? Voters who don't have faith in the existing political system to deliver for their needs and desires are persuasion targets, regardless of whatever their like political, regardless of where they fall on the left-right spectrum. People who, are not sure whether or not they are, people who maybe have voted on the Democratic side in reaction to Trump need to be treated as people who, are really trying to reconcile competing values within their own overall political ecosystem and who need to be held and sort of brought in via that framework. Now, let's see, additional points. Gosh, there's a lot. In terms of the actual question around how do we bring those stories home and how do we make sure that they resonate? I think one piece of this really is, again, you can talk a lot about like what is the message, but ultimately, and I think we're all agreeing here, the messenger is often a lot more important. So, I'm a Jewish lady from Washington, D.C., and I am not the right messenger in a lot of places to talk in terms of the values that already are shared in a community around, like, why is my Christian faith motivating me to be so alarmed at what is happening right now? Why is my role as, a like member of the PTA causing me to be so alarmed at this thing that is happening in our schools? A lot of times it's about making sure that folks have the tools and the capabilities and the right sort of overall framing and training to have those conversations, but also recognizing that a lot of times the legitimacy and the credibility is going to come from people's own genuine roles, from the roles they play in their communities, sometimes from their own qualifications in the work that they've done before. A lot of times indivisibles themselves, like they're not professionals. They are teachers. They are, salespeople. They are nurses. They are able to come and bring the actual experiences that they have had in their life and the values that they are bringing into the conversation around how does what is happening in Washington potentially directly impact me? Because that's the other piece of this. I think a hard thing that we have seen over the last few years that I don't love it. You don't love it. The reality is that most people really need to hear and understand why abstract principles of democracy are connected to real and tangible things about their lives. We don't tend to get, I wish that we saw the penalties that we should for people breaking norms. We really don't, unless that is brought home to people and it's brought home to them how it exactly affects them. And I think Shayna is exactly right in talking about this in terms of corruption. A lot of the times, what we're talking about is the political system is not working for you. It is working for these people over here, and they like it that way. And so it's not just about the individual issues. It's also about a broader orientation that gives people the belief that re-engaging with the political system is actually about shifting it over the long term into something that actually delivers for them.
Leah, we are living in a nation today, I think that, as each of you has said, is the result of not from 2016 on. It's the result of Lewis Powell and his memorandum in 1972. It's about the prior history before that. But what we discovered in 2016 was that social media, soundbite news, and a variety of other tools have actually wreaked havoc on what was already a fragile population. What I want to know is, when will we, who are out to try to save democracy, recognize the power of these tools to tell stories about truth that impact the views of people who have been dissuaded from democracy? So each one of you has been intelligent and articulate in that, but I don't see any gathering of activist organizations, of people really gifted with social media, who are doing the very same thing to correct the problem that has caused the problem.
And the reason for that, George, is because these algorithms are designed in a way that actually allows misinformation to spread much more rapidly and successfully than the truth. It is not possible, based on the way these algorithms are designed and how these companies make money and profit, which is by enraging people and having bombastic, viral tweets and posts that gain that virality and that momentum because they are so often actually untrue. It is not possible to create that same, replicate that impact and that reality for truth, unless we are to have some sort of massive coordination of every single person on one side versus the other, which unfortunately is very difficult, right? We do not have that sort of political power and that sort of coordination and trust on the left. And that is a huge problem, right? Like the left is very weak right now relative to the right. And I would not disagree. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But unfortunately, I hear what you're saying. Obviously, young people get most of their information from social media. So I'm hyper aware of this issue. Unfortunately, it's really not that easy to replicate what has happened with the spreading of misinformation and the undermining of public trust and democracy as a result on social media. Because again, these companies profit from algorithms that allow misinformation to spread much more rapidly. So I just want to name that. And I, am very open to any other great ideas that folks have about how to use social media effectively. But I think the reality is, social media is like all of our platforms and our accounts, they're echo chambers, right? So it's the same unfortunate reality of a lot of our social conversations and in-person networks these days. We are just increasingly only spending time with people who already agree with us. And social media is the epitome of that. And so it is difficult, even if you're posting every day, the truth, we need to get the truth out there. You're not going to make a lot of progress on social media, because the people who follow you and see your posts are people who already agree with you. So the idea that I was going to propose in terms of how do we get this truth out there, and this is just a lesson that I would love to impart in terms of how to do good organizing. A lot of people, young people and old these days, they will put in effort and feel like they are trying to recruit and organize an event in a way that is actually self-sabotaging. And by that, I mean they will send out emails. And they'll start a group text and say, hey, please come over. Let's watch the January 6th trials together, for example. Group texts and emails have the least accountability of probably any form of invitation or organizing that we could possibly initiate, right? If you want someone to come to something, you need to make them feel special, and you need to make it catered and individual to them. So what I would suggest is, if you really feel like there's so much truth and value in these stories that we are being told about by virtue of the investigation into January 6th, not enough people are listening to them, have a watch party at your house and reach out to people in your network individually over the phone, or even better, in person, and say, hey, I thought of you because I'm really enjoying listening to this investigation, and I would really love for you to join me and watch this with me. And invite them to your house. Can you come? That is a hard ask. We call that in organizing. Can you come? And invite them over, make it a social thing, have food, have drinks, and have it be community building. But you have to ask them in a way that actually compels them to come. And you need to make it fun and not just about shaming them and their politics. And you need to do these things in person, because just doing them on social media, unfortunately, is never going to fix the problem that social media has created.
So I'm going to add that it's gotten harder and harder to get people with the different point of view to show up for something. And it absolutely, that personal ask is your best bet. And, that's why the design of the living room conversations was originally two friends with different views, each invite two friends, because so many of us don't have diversity in our networks. And I actually co-hosted a living room conversation with a co-founder of Tea Party Patriots once, because a friend of mine said, oh, I know the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. So it may not even be a friend of yours. It might be a friend introducing you to a friend. Sometimes it's got to be that much distance. But it is, the social media thing is fear, anger, and anxiety are the things that get passed on. And many years ago, Move On was concerned because when you do an event, it was no longer the town square where people gathered, it was a mall, and a mall is privately owned. And our online spaces are privately owned. There is a real need to reinvent what are public spaces that are not influenced by a profit motive. There's some, and there's some very good people thinking about this challenge, but it's something we need to be intentional and own our own space. One of the things I've put a bunch of conversation guides that what we've been talking about made me think of in the chat on the side. Technology and relationships is one of my favorites because, left and right's not so much of a big deal, so much as age differences in how technology has impacted your relationships. And once people get talking about that, often one conversation leads to a next, such as news in the modern world, expectations versus reality. But there's the becoming aware of how we create our own understanding of the world and expanding our understanding is something that takes more time than signing a petition. This is that deeper organizing work. And what I love is this group. I'm learning that you guys are doing amazing work. So thank you for telling me about that. I'm enjoying listening to the panel too, a great deal. Thank you.
I love your
Let me
truth.
ask you a question that tracks what also George was saying.
If I could jump in with 1 second, just because we actually do run a disinformation program that's might be sort of related to the original question, and I just don't want to. So we actually started in 2019 a program that was specifically around, recognizing that we face huge structural problems related to the platforms, their ownership, their management, and the algorithm. Was there still tangible ways that you could use volunteer-based messaging and infrastructure to try and at least narrow the ratio of times that people were hearing the right-wing message versus hearing our message, something that was debunking right-wing disinformation, something that was helping people to have a more critical read of what was going on. And so we worked with a set of disinformation researchers around and messaging folks around, what are the best ways that you actually are empowering folks with the tools to debunk, but also to promote a positive alternate message, because a lot of the best practices on this stuff is that if you just try and say, oh, you heard that, that's not true, that doesn't work. What you have to do is basically talk about why something that is not true is spreading and what the motives are behind the people who are spreading it. And then offer an alternate and positive frame for people to kind of take what they understand and hook to instead. So training people and also not spreading disinformation, because one of the ways that this stuff spreads is people who are mad about it, amplify the things that make them mad. To Shayna's point, that's true on our side too. And it actually helps give additional power to the stuff that is problematic moving around. So we have been working on that since 2019. We actually just launched a collective coalition of different organizations that have come together to bring their own volunteers basically into this ecosystem. Our first year, we got about 100 million impressions through this program. We're hoping to significantly increase that number through this coalition. And the folks who are involved are working specifically with kind of a democracy defenders orientation around particularly mistruth or misinformation and spread around January 6th and ongoing attacks on the sanctity of our elections, and promoting and making sure folks are aware of the ongoing attack that is happening on how our elections are administered. So this is a work in progress. And I think we both fully acknowledge that, we are trying to work within a broken system in order to, at the margins, address some of the ways in which it imbalances towards the right wing. There are folks who are doing sort of more systemic pressure on some of the platforms to try and change the way that those algorithms work. Shout out folks like Color of Change, who have been doing really, really good work on this for a long time. It's going to take kind of an all of the above approach.
Leah, I agree. And that someone in the chat, Cuff Ferguson, who is a professor at University of Massachusetts and a guest on Humanity Rising on several occasions, says, he said, I've been hoping that, for an example, the story that Lady Ruby and her daughter told at the previous event, that some of the videos that have been shown that actually have Republican judges and the chief of staff for Pence and all of these people actually speaking their truth. What I don't understand is why we don't have a mechanism that simply, as things go viral, share those videos. We don't have to make a big deal about it, but someone has to be able to communicate those kinds of stories that can have an impact. That's what I keep hoping that you at this very meeting you're at in Virginia could, or the coalition that you're putting together, could talk about how do we do simply that? How do we make stories of emotion, of feeling, and of truth? How do we encourage them to go viral? And in that way, without ever having to say a thing about them, without saying this is why you should vote or who should vote or whatnot, these stories are so powerful. That's what I keep hoping.
This is maybe back to me, so I'll just jump in
Sure.
with a couple of thoughts. I do think one thing that I think is important to say that is challenging and asymmetric in the ways that we approach problems is, I would say the other side, I'm going to mangle this, and other folks on the call can come in and get this right. But if you think about kind of the deep narrative is kind of like the tree that you hang your stories on, where people need they need a way of understanding the story and putting it in part of a broader understanding of how the world works, and that deeper story is often what governs people. So my family in Alabama, who are very much not one conversation away from joining our side, but who I continue to engage with nonetheless. They have a story, right? They have a story that is about a homogenous community that has been good, that is under threat from a government that largely wants to take what they have and give it to undeserving others. And the others are all of the things that you would imagine around race and gender and imposing cultural norms and all of these things, right? And that is a story that allows them to fit many different kinds of disinformation right into that framework and be reaffirmed in their worldview. We collectively have a set of questions around how do we hit people regularly with our messages, but we also have to be really clear on what our underlying story is that we are telling, so that people understand how to hear that and put it into a worldview that is about a bigger we, an inclusive, multiracial, pluralistic we that is stronger and better and more a better society together, and where we help each other, right? And that can often be the challenge, as much as kind of can we make this one story go viral? It's can we link it back to that big, that big tree where we're actually reaffirming people in an overarching belief structure.
Shane, anything you'd want to add to that, or Joan?
It's a really good point, George. I think we all are very frustrated that we don't have a better system to counteract the misinformation that we're up against. And you're right that powerful stories and truth are just really important messages that people need to hear and should much more easily be able to proliferate in the way that misinformation does. And that's just unfortunately not the reality that we're working with right now. And so I think it comes back to the question of what can we actually do, any of us as individuals at this given moment. I think the answer is working within our own networks, but I think the answer is also strengthening organizations and institutions that we do have, that if they were stronger, would be able to, in a more comprehensive, scaled way, be arbiters of truth in a way that we no longer have, right? We all cater our own information. We all watch our own news. We all have our own social media. And that is in so many ways what has led to this deterioration of trust and community and unity and society. And that problem is not going to fix itself on its own. It is going to require us investing in institutions, whether it's your local indivisible chapter or, for young people, your campus chapter of Unpack, or if we're going old school, Lions Club or any of these other community groups that really have become less of a priority in American life and less of a norm, but are still really crucial in terms of trying to create that sense of shared ownership over our community and ultimately a shared truth that can counteract a lot of this misinformation. So I think there's no easy fix, and there's no, aha, here's the answer that we all wish there were, but there's not. And so we can all take individual actions, both within our networks and to actually strengthen these institutions and community around us so that we can have more of a shared consensus of what is the truth and what matters in terms of messages that we want our community to hear.
I want you to know that none of this is
Let
a
me follow up
criticism.
on that. Just a sec. What I'm hearing, which to me is a common thread here, is really on the ground relational organizing. And Joan, on the ground can also be viral because it's really individuals. Shayna, you're talking about relational organizing. Leah and Shayna, you're talking about deep canvassing, which is that as well. But it's meeting people where they're at about what they care about is kind of a theme that I really feel is emergent here that's common to what you're doing. So Leah, my question is, given Indivisible and the 3,000 groups you have around the country, which is extraordinary, and Joan or Leah, given Move On, and a lot of the grassroots work that happens with Move On, and Shayna, given your Unpack, where, you spent a year in West Virginia and in Arizona trying to influence 2 senators who have been obfuscating an awful lot of stuff, but including the Voting Rights Act, which would have made a difference. You really put a whole year into that. How do we bring those of you who are doing this on the ground work, both for Code Red for Democracy in the short term and the work in the longer term? Leah, you're out there in coalition building, but I'd be curious because to me, that's an answer to what George is asking. And Joan, you are too. So I'd love to hear from each of you. Is there a movement of sympathetic, common organizations working together at a certain level, both to address whether it's the story, whether it's voting, whether it's the long term? Because I think we need everybody. And you all are really connected to a whole field of people and organizations doing common work.
Well, I'll talk about the bridging movement because there's a whole bridging movement which Living Room Conversations is part of. And that's hundreds of organizations that are doing local work to get people connected. And the amazing thing about Zoom is once people start having that capacity and interest, we actually now have millions of people that are comfortable with Zoom. And we know that we can have high quality connections now remotely. And we haven't done enough of this, but we need to.
But how do those connections, Joan, lead to people voting? And I really appreciate the conversations you're having between voters and non-voters. How does that translate into Code Orange or Code Red for democracy?
If you're having those conversations about, you can have those conversations about voting or not voting, whatever people, it's meeting people where they're at, what they're interested in, and giving them the capacity to feel like they can be a meaningful part of shifting things. And
so, for example, is an indivisible chapter a piece of information? Or, because Shane, I know you're looking to train people this summer, and to enlarge what you're doing on campuses and the work you're doing with young people. Does the bridging movement know where to direct people who want to get more specific on the kinds of organizations that we have on today?
the bridging movement is not in the fight. It's a tool that we have all sorts of tools that folks that are working on the election can grab and use for expanding the base. You know, the In This Together has a theory that there are 15% of the folks on the right and 15% on the folks on the left that are kind of immovable, but you've got 70% of the population that wants to get solutions around climate in particular. I think that's probably true about having a functional democracy. And I think the challenging thing about the advocacy organizations is, like the news and social media, they grow by emphasizing the fear, the anger, the ain't it awful. That's where you get more donations. That's where you get more activism. And so you've got a dynamic of something that's feeding into the dysfunction, feeding into funding the fight. And so you've got these two competing interests in that space.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not, I don't have the answer for it.
Sure.
But you know, Shayna and Leah, I'm hoping you do. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I can respond to this just from the standpoint of, I think that we should all be really honest with ourselves about what is possible in the short term. It is a great ambition to have everyone who's listening to this and people in our networks turn out in the midterm elections. The midterm elections, that said, are not looking very good for those of us who identify more with the Democratic Party and want Democrats to win. It's just not looking good. And I don't think that we should get our hopes up and have really high expectations that we are going to keep, you know, for example, all three houses of government. That is not the view that Unpack has. And we need to be focused on the long game, in our opinion, because that is the timeline that we need to work on in order to actually fix a lot of the problems that we're up against. And that is the only timeline where we actually have viable chances of success. That said, we are in a moment of crisis, right? And so that is why we are focusing on these really imperative races in key states that will allow us to safeguard our democracy from total collapse. But we are not trying to return to some golden era or create some golden era where democracy is truly representative of everyone after the midterms. John is right that the Freedom to Vote Act, John R. Lewis Act, would have really made things a lot better. We didn't win. But the reason that Unpack was able to make such an impact and had so many young people taking really bold, courageous, direct action in Arizona and DC and ran the largest door-to-door canvass in West Virginia history to move Senator Manchin, which worked, by the way. We can have another panel to do a postmortem. I would love to. Is because we did real deep organizing for a year. And it mattered, and it allowed young people to feel empowered to take meaningful action that moved the entire Congress to vote on this bill at the end of last year. That may not have happened if it weren't for the 20 and then 40 young people hunger striking in DC, forcing that issue. Of course, the vote was not successful, but we still made dramatic progress. So I think we need to be really honest with ourselves about what we can achieve in the short and long term. And I don't think that we should be expecting things to be really wonderful and rosy after the midterm election, because that's just not where we are. We need to do the most that we can to prevent the worst damage and disintegration of our democracy when the midterm elections roll around. But we really need to be focused on 2024 and the long game and what that means for us as an organization in terms of where we actually trying to make up ground. It is at the hyper-local level. John, there was a national coalition called the Declaration for American Democracy Coalition that was leading the efforts to try to pass federal democracy reform legislation, namely the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act at the end. And that was an example of a coordinated group of hundreds of organizations that were working together. We didn't win, though. And now the prospect for federal legislation is very barren for the next decade. And we need to be okay with that. We need to focus locally because that is where we have power. That is where we have the most viable chances of success. And while we all would love to hear, because we live in this hyper-connected world, oh yeah, there's some master plan and everyone at the national level is working together and we're all coordinated, it's just not happening. And it's also not what should be happening, because again, Congress is the most broken government entity when we think of where we can make progress right now. We should be focusing locally and at the state level to safeguard our democracy where we can. And the Arizonans for Fair Elections is a really great example of a ballot initiative that would do this, so that we can build up enough power in our individual communities and states to ultimately get back to a place where federal democracy reform legislation is possible. But it's not going to be November, and it's probably not going to be 2024 either.
Well, I just want to say that I celebrate, honestly, the courage and the commitment that each of the three of you have and that your organizations demonstrate. And at the moment, I have a heart that is truly sad, because I personally don't believe 2024 is even going to exist if we don't do something significantly different in 2022. And I believe that the reason that the outlook is bleak for 2022 is that we, those of us who want to save democracy, still haven't become sophisticated enough and prioritized enough and committed enough to do what the other side has done to make 2022 such a risk circumstance. And I don't say that as criticism to any of you. I celebrate and applaud the courageous work that each of you do. But I believe in the 140-something days remaining, we better wake up to a different reality. We better unbuckle our belts, take off our blinders, step outside the lines of traditional things, as well as do each one of the things that each of you has said. Not an or, but an and. But let's not kid ourselves. 2022 is where democracy is going to live or die. Because if we lose the House and the Senate, and we have an administration that is basically, that it already has its hands tied, thanks to 2 Democratic senators, we will not make progress on any of the other systemic issues that we face. So that's just my personal belief. I'm not speaking for John or for Humanity Rising. I'm just speaking for myself. But I ask, I plead, I pray that we wake up from the delusion that 2024 or beyond might even exist for democracy. And we give it every damn thing we have to give it between now and the elections to make it different.
Leah, anything you want to say to that? Because you guys are on the ground. I mean, we're all on the ground. But a word here from you?
Can't agree enough. I think the most damaging thing that I have heard from a few folks floating around is sort of like, well, 2022 is already lost, so what's the point? And one, it is not. Like, we can see the odds. The odds are steep. Midterms are hard, but it is not actually lost. There are really important things that are coming that give us the opportunity to make the case for why democratic governance is important and why MAGA extremism is a threat to your freedom, your safety, your well-being, your right to vote, all of the above. We're planning and actively strategizing on it. The other thing is just, this is not a binary. You do not like win or lose an election and thus every seat in the country is Republican or Democratic, right? Like, there are a zillion local county clerk races. There are state legislative races. There are congressional races. There's, an enormous difference between whether we hold 50 seats in the Senate or lose 3 seats in the Senate in terms of what position we are in 2024 to possibly have a trifecta that would allow us to pass legislation again, or having that be totally out of reach. All of these things matter a lot. So the idea of kind of like, well, this election is, this is on hostile terrain, so I'm going to be less involved. No, this is actually more important that you're involved now. So that is one piece. And I think that we agree completely that we have to continue to be like really creative and really thoughtful, not just about how do we reach out to voters, but how do we shape the ground on which the election is taking place, so that when people are asking, what is this election about? The answer leads them to take the time out of their day to vote and to vote for us.
So one of the things we didn't get around today, which we really do with every panelist, is to ask each of you what you need for your own organization. How can we help? So let me start with you, Shayna, and then go to Joan, and then to Leah, and then George. We can decide whether we want to bring Jim in and go a little bit longer today. But Shayna, why don't you jump in on this? How can we support Unpack?
Yeah, that link didn't work. Let me do it again. My classic, you would think I knew how to send links over Zoom chat by now. So Unpack is the only nonpartisan pro-democracy youth organization in the country. We formed very much out of necessity, I usually say, because as John has mentioned, and as I've mentioned, last year we had this really historic opportunity to pass federal democracy reform legislation that would have really safeguarded our democracy against a lot of the attacks that we're seeing now. And there was no youth organization that was really leading the charge, and young people just weren't aware or talking about it. When the reality, as I mentioned earlier, is that solutions to essentially every single problem that young people care about, which is on the whole, climate change, gun violence, student debt, access to affordable healthcare, are all blocked by our dysfunctional democracy. So we started Unpack to help fill that gap, and we ended up filling lots of other gaps, including running the ground game in West Virginia to move Senator Manchin on this issue, ran the largest canvass in the state, in the history of the state. We staged a series of hunger strike direct actions in Arizona and DC with 20 and then 40 young people participating to really bring attention to this crisis of our democracy, and would encourage everyone on this call to, view nonviolent direct action as a meaningful, important way to protest and to really try to move the needle right now, because, we are in a moment of emergency, and our tactics should reflect that, of course, in an organized way. Don't do it by yourself. Make sure there's a plan and there's a strategy, but we really do believe in raising the stakes through any tactic that's available to us that is strategic in that moment. And we are now launching campaigns, or we've recently launched campaigns in 5 states that I mentioned in the chat. And our model is that we employ students to organize their own campus. This is a version of relational organizing, right? They have the most power over other students at their school who they have shared experience with. So we actually hire them, we train them, and then we employ and support them to organize their communities, to run campaigns that allow them to register young people to vote and have young people turn out in important elections. And so we pay our folks $15 an hour. We're very intentional about making sure that we can account for the access barrier for a lot of working class young people who don't have opportunities to organize unless it is paid, unfortunately. So I'm sure people are tired of hearing this, but resources are always the best way to support our organization. We are very, very small and scrappy, and we are very good at organizing. We don't try to do too many other things. Fundraising we do out of necessity, but we really want to focus on the organizing and doing the work. So if you are able to make a contribution of any size, that's greatly appreciated, and you can do so at our website. Other than that, though, be good messengers for democracy for young people in your network. Like, that is a really important way to help Unpack. Again, it's not about saying to young people who we know, our relatives or our neighbors, voting is so important, please do it. It's about what issues do you care about and helping them to understand how those issues are connected to our broken democracy. So I would urge all of us to resist the temptation to, lecture and debate with folks, especially young people, and shame them if they don't vote or they don't believe in the promise of our democracy, because again, they haven't seen it work for them their entire lives. And to be better messengers for democracy as a means of enabling action on the issues that young people care about is a really great way to support us.
Thank you. Joan, over to you.
Great way to sort of support us. I will also put our information in there, and it won't go. It's not fair.
But,
Sometimes-
George, let me ask you a question. People who are watching this over YouTube and Facebook do not see the chat. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, Shayna, first,
There is, however, in the information about the program and information about the replays, there are URLs associated with each of the
Right.
individuals who are participating, so people can contact the organization directly.
But Shayna, while we're here, just say what your website is, and then Joan, please do the same.
Yeah, it's just unpack-pac.org.
Okay. Joan?
And we're living room conversations, plural.org. And basically the best thing for us is to have people join our work. And we have people doing this in faith communities and libraries, in their homes. It's living room conversations, but it's found itself all over the place. It's open source. We have over 150 conversation guides, and as Shayna was saying, it's always good to have more resources. That's something we're hugely grateful for, but leaders in communities taking this and finding ways that it really serves your community is the most valuable thing, and then letting us know about it, because as we were saying, stories are incredibly powerful. So getting back to us with the stories of how you've used these conversations. So if you have one of the voting conversations with a intergenerational group or a non-intergenerational group, tell us about it and let us share that story.
Thank you,
We'd love to
Joan.
do that.
Leah?
I will pop in the chat box, but also say you can go to indivisible.org, or you can go to givenoground.org, which is our midterms election action platform.
Say that one more time.
Givenoground.org.
Give no ground.
Our midterms campaign is called Give No Ground. We have opportunities for you to get involved as an individual. We also like nothing more than for everybody here to find their local indivisible group. You can find that via our website. We have a map for indivisible groups all over the country, and reach out to them directly. If there's not one in your area, seriously consider starting one. Indivisible groups do not, we are based on the premise that if we are going to collectively save our democracy, it takes more than people who are, working in and based in nonprofits. It takes people all over the country who are bringing together, anything from a book club sized group of people to a big auditorium sized group of people, to say, how can we actually take action, improve our community, and build people's faith in our democracy? So it really doesn't require, it requires the skills that you already have and the network that you already have. So if you are looking for a more involved way to take action, please consider that. And then, of course, we also would appreciate funds. This is a tough fundraising year for everyone, for all of the reasons that we talk about it being a tough year for folks who are feeling, disempowered and and disappointed and nervous about 2022. The time when money goes the farthest is the times when things are the toughest. And so if you are able to support, then that is a huge contribution to us in being able to do the most impactful program and offer the best opportunities to folks to have an impact in 2022.
Thank you.
Jim, do you want to come in and send us on our way? As he's getting ready to do that, before we leave, I want to say that I love Bucky Fuller, and I love the fact that one of the pieces of wisdom that he left us was a statement that says that we are born to be the architects of the future and not its victims. And I encourage each one of us to be the best damn architects we can be for the next 140 something days and then beyond. Tim, are you there?
Thank you, George. Thank you, John and Leah and Joan and Scanna. This has been just a marvelous, marvelous session. what I've been feeling is sort of what Jung called the antinomial nature of reality, where two internally consistent but mutually exclusive forces are operating. On the one hand, you have everything that the coup plotters are attempting, and on the other hand, you've got the three of you and hundreds of other organizations and thousands of activists who are in the trenches, just passionately trying to keep the flame alive. And I was just realizing that this is the drama of history. This is the drama of the unfoldment of human values against the anvil of the human condition. And the heroism that each of you are embodying, I would say, at this moment is just extraordinary. And I just want to acknowledge it and thank you for it, and to say that no matter how dark it is out there, you have brought great light to all of us today. And I want to just express my gratitude for that. I feel better in my soul having heard your dialogue today. And John and George, thank you so much for bringing these three forces of nature into our midst, because this is what it takes, everyone, to move history and bend that arc, as Martin Luther King said, toward justice. And we've seen that today, and I want to acknowledge and thank you all for that. That'll end our session. This is the fourth of 5 sessions. Tomorrow we will conclude our program here on Humanity Rising on the challenge and crisis of democracy. You're all welcome to the after chat session. You'll see the link in the chat box, those of you who can access the chat box. And we'll see all of you tomorrow, same time, same station, here on Humanity Rising. Thank you all so much. Bye for now.